There has been, and I think one of the things that has driven some of the concern about evolutionary theory is a kind of fear of what seem to be the moral implications of evolutionary theory. This has certainly been the case not only today, but in previous years. So one of the individuals who was so concerned was George Bernard Shaw. And here's what Shaw had to say in the preface to his play, 1921, Back to Methuselah. You cannot understand Moses without imagination, nor Spurgeon, who was a famous preacher of the day, without metaphysics. But you can be a thoroughgoing neo-Darwinian without imagination, metaphysics, poetry, conscience, or decency. For natural selection has no moral significance. It deals with that part of evolution which has no purpose, no intelligence, and might more appropriately be called accidental selection, or better still, unnatural selection, since nothing is more unnatural than an accident. If it could be proved that the whole universe had been produced by such selection, only fools and rascals could bear to live. Well, one of those rascals is Dan Dennett. He seems to have been doing just fine. In his book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, I think sometimes it should be amended to Dan Dennett's Dangerous Idea. Dennett affirms, in fact, Shaw's characterization of Darwin's accomplishment. Here's what Dennett says. Darwin explains a world of final causes and teleological laws with a principle that is, to be sure, mechanistic, but more fundamentally, utterly independent of meaning or purpose. It assumes a world that is absurd in the existentialist sense of that term, not ludicrous, but pointless. And this assumption is a necessary condition of any non-question begging account of purpose. Now, this is a perfectly common assessment of Darwin's accomplishment. Darwin banished notions of purpose and teleology from scientific understanding of nature. He introduced blind, mechanical processes to explain species descent. In his world, according to this view, human beings have no special place. Indeed, our evolution is assumed to be highly contingent. It could have been the case that at this point, the only thing that existed are beetles. And Darwin was actually particularly interested in beetles. But it seems, at least under this interpretation, the existence of human beings need not have occurred at all. Now, I don't think Shaw and Dan Dennett and those who hold this general position are correct. What I'm going to try to show you today, in a rather abbreviated fashion, is that if you read Darwin carefully, you can still hear the sweet birds sing. Darwinian nature, at least as originally conceived by its author, was not bereft of meaning or moral values, as both Shaw and Dennett presume. And as I say, this is the common presumption of many contemporary evolutionary thinkers. I rather think that Darwin demonstrated the power of mind in nature. Darwin was indeed an individual who ushered in the modern world in biology in the 20th and 21st century. But I think, and this has to be stressed, he was an individual whose values, assumptions, and science were formed in the pre-modern world of the early 19th century. So let me attempt briefly to show you that Darwin constructed his theory using conceptions of a rather traditional sort. When one comes, I think, to understand exactly what the instruments of construction were, the whole Bauplan, the whole scheme appears, I think, in a rather different light. Not quite so harsh or impervious to human aspirations, not quite so meaningless as both Dennett and Shaw believed. So what were the instruments of his construction of his theory? Well, teleological causality, a presumption of moral embeddedness, a conception of mind at work in the universe. The result was a universe with a distinctive developmental trajectory in Darwin's view, namely human beings as authentically moral creatures. Darwin obliquely expressed this trajectory in that famous peroration that concludes The Origin of Species. As he says in that last paragraph of the book, when he recounts the laws that he has distinguished in that book, laws such as variability, divergence of character, and particularly natural selection, he goes on, "These laws have produced the most exalted object we're capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals. That directly follows. There's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, are being and have been evolved." The most exalted object we're capable of conceiving, the highest animal, of course, is us, human beings, with our moral sentiments. As Darwin earlier contended, what seemed distinctive of human beings was not their reasoning ability. If you're an early 19th century British empiricist, you will be convinced that your dog, for example, has more than a modicum of reason, perhaps comparable to your servant. You're sure of that as you go hunting, where the dog seems to do a better job than your manservant. So that animals were not bereft of intelligence. That wasn't the barrier that was going to separate human beings from lower creatures. It was morality. No animal is a moral being, only human beings are. So Darwin felt that he had to give an account of human morality, and that's certainly what he tried to do. And that's what makes human beings the highest animal, because of their moral character. And that, I believe, is what Darwin was alluding to in this passage from The Origin. Now, needless to say, this is not the usual picture of Darwin's accomplishment. He's most often represented by the likes of Michael Geeslin, Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, Richard Dawkins, Michael Roos, Dan Dennett, and a host of others, as having banished teleology from nature, as having constructed natural selection as a blind mechanical process that hasn't the least tincture of non-selfish character about it. As one of these scholars, Michael Geeslin, so delicately put it, "Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed." Now, as I mentioned, I think Darwin, in fact, constructed nature as having a goal or an end, namely human beings as moral creatures. Moreover, he advanced a view of human nature that made human beings authentically moral creatures, not hypocritically selfish with a facade of altruism, but authentically altruist. Before I detail these arguments, perhaps let me just recap a bit of Darwin's own trajectory. Darwin was born in 1809. He was the son of Robert Waring Darwin, a well-to-do Shrewsbury physician, and he was the grandson of the even more famous Erasmus Darwin, who had, in the latter part of the 18th century, developed his own theory of the transmutation of species. Darwin followed his grandfather, his father, and his elder brother to Edinburgh Medical School, and he spent 2 awful years at Edinburgh before he came down. He was just ill-equipped to be a physician. Darwin's father was greatly disappointed in him. In his autobiography, Darwin recalled that his father once said to him, you care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and your whole family." Darwin quickly remarked, though, that his father who was the most generous and kindest man I ever knew, and whom I loved with my whole heart, must have been angry and somewhat unjust when he used such words. The father had a plan for the son that he would be a country parson. The father had no strong religious views at all, but nonetheless, he thought that for the younger son of the English gentry, being a country parson was quite appropriate, and Darwin found that the whole idea was rather appealing. So he went to Cambridge University with the idea of becoming a parson. At least he held that for a while as his aim. After his senior year, however, he got the opportunity to sail away from England on a surveying ship, HMS Beagle, and his travels lasted almost 5 years. He set sail in December of 1831, and he returned in October of 1836. During his time on the Beagle, it is probably the case that he remained orthodox in his biology. Darwin, if he were put on the psychoanalytic couch, he would probably be called anal retentive because he never let anything go. So every scrap of paper that he ever put pen to, including his grammar school notebooks, he preserved, and they now exist at Cambridge University in the Special Collections Unit, so that we can trace Darwin's development fairly carefully. So in the diaries that he kept while on board the Beagle, there's only one sentence that perhaps suggests that he was thinking about the possibility of change of species over time. But generally speaking, the preponderance of evidence was that he didn't really consider that at all. When he got back to England, however, he started sorting the flora and fauna that he sent back on merchant ships. So during the 5-year voyage, periodically a ship would pick up some of the animals, the plants, and also the fossils that Darwin found during the voyage and ship them back to England. And when Darwin got back, he, along with several members of the British Museum, went through those collections and started describing and cataloging them. Among the collections, and which Darwin sent back, were some mockingbirds. So Darwin, while he was on the Galapagos, he would capture several different kinds of birds, hawks, finches, mockingbirds. And if any of you have traveled to the Galapagos, you know that one of the distinguishing features of the animals that exist on the islands is that they have no fear of human beings, actually now, much to their peril. So Darwin, in capturing, for example, a mockingbird or a hawk, he would walk up to a branch where the hawk was standing, take the end of his rifle butt and then knock him on the head and have a bag underneath him and catch the hawk, take him back to the ship and throw him in a barrel of spirits of wine for preservation. And ultimately, the birds that he captured would be sent back to England. But when he got back to England, and he was working with John Gould, who was the foremost ornithologist of the period, at least in England, Darwin thought that these mockingbirds were varieties of a species that had got blown over from the mainland. Now, as you may know, the Galapagos are about 600 miles from Ecuador. And Darwin, at this period, was au courant with the most recent geology going, the geology of Sir Charles Lyell. And Lyell was convinced that the world was very much older than the biblical account would suggest, that it was without any hint of a beginning or any vestige of an end. So the world was very old, and Darwin estimated, on the basis of the deposition of volcanic material on the Galapagos are volcanic islands, that the islands were about 1 million years old. And from our contemporary perspective, he wasn't far wrong. It's about 1.5 million. So what he believed is that the birds and the tree iguana that existed on the mainland got occasionally blown over to the Galapagos Islands, perhaps a storm, or the iguana would be on, say, grass mats that also drifted over to the islands. So they would come to populate the islands in that fashion. And while they were there, they could be altered by the impact of the environment, but only within the parameters of their species. So these mockingbirds, Darwin believed, were actually varieties of a species that existed on the mainland. And he had a notion of how they were altered. And that was perfectly good contemporary biology as far as Darwin was concerned. But when he got back to England and he talked to John Gould about these mockingbirds, Gould said, well, these aren't varieties. these are good species. And this tripped a mind at the ready. At the ready because undoubtedly he had in mind his own grandfather's views about the possibility of species transformation, and he also knew about the work of Jean-Pierre Baptiste de Lamarck, a French zoologist who also maintained, prior to Darwin, that species changed over time as the result of, for the most part, many of you will know this, through the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So that animal organisms, for example, would be in a particular environment. They would adopt or develop certain habits to deal with the environment, and those habits would gradually change their anatomies, and that could be passed on to their offspring. Now, we no longer believe that to be the case, but that was Lamarck's view, and that view of Lamarck, as well as that of Darwin's grandfather, were thoroughly derided by the academic and intellectual communities of Britain and France at the time, which is one of the reasons why Darwin probably was not ready to jump on board just because his grandfather had developed these ideas. Darwin, wanted to be accepted within this intellectual community. But it looked as though the evidence was beginning to suggest that they may have been correct. So Darwin, when he got back to England in 1837, he started thinking, got back in 1836, but in 1837 when he talked to Gould about the mockingbirds, he began to think carefully about the possibilities of the transmutation of species. And he kept a series of notebooks. And let me just indicate to you this period prior to the publication of The Origin of Species, what Darwin was doing, so you have a rough idea of what occurred. So in 1837, 1842, Darwin is in London, and he is working on his species theory, and he's trying to figure out what the causes were of the transmutation of species. And the first ideas he had were along those Lamarckian lines. In 1842, he spins out a little essay, a pencil essay, about 35 manuscript pages or so, of this idea that he is beginning to work on. And 2 years later, in 1844, he expands that to about 250 or so pages. And interestingly, at this point, he has a good copy made, what is usually called a fair copy. And this would be the kind of manuscript that a printer could work from. So he hired a copyist because his own hand, certainly during the 1840s and 50s, deteriorated to such a degree that he himself had a hard time reading his own handwriting. And for those of us who try to scrutinize Darwin's hand, it is really a headache. With his letters, there is a bright light that can be shined on his letters because after a point, the people with whom Darwin was communicating finally said, "I cannot read your letter at all." At that point, he dictated his letters to his wife, and she very carefully would copy out the letters and send them along. So, but Darwin has 400 pounds put in a legacy of 400 pounds mentioned in his will that should he die before this great idea appeared, this essay, this 250-page essay, would be published. Darwin, when he got back from the Beagle voyage, was suffering from many maladies. He had digestive problems, he had heart palpitation, he had fits of giddiness. One of the great problems in Darwin scholarship is to try to figure out what was wrong with the poor man. He was always going to take the waters at Malvern to try to cure whatever ailment he had. But in any case, he thought on several occasions he might die before his idea was revealed to the public, and he left the 400 pounds in his will just to make sure that that didn't happen. And in 1848 to 54, Darwin gets sidetracked. He brought back some examples of barnacles, and he thought he would describe one odd barnacle and publish a paper on it. Well, he couldn't really describe that until he had described another one related to it, and he couldn't describe that until he described another one, and he couldn't describe, well, by the time he finished, he had written 4 large folio volumes on barnacles, and he detested the animals at that point. He never wanted to look at another barnacle again. This did sidetrack him from the work that he was doing on his theory a bit, but he took it up again, and in roughly 1856, he begins work on a large manuscript. The work is interrupted in 1858 by a letter from an obscure naturalist in Borneo by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace sends him an essay and says, if you think there's anything to it, would you talk to Sir Charles Lyell and recommend it to Lyell? Darwin had more heart palpitations because when he read the essay, he said it was as if Wallace were looking over his shoulder and copying out of his notebooks. So similar were the ideas. Lyell and other of Darwin's friends had to convince him that his originality was not destroyed, but he should continue working on the manuscript, and what he did is compress the manuscript, abbreviate it, and then he had about 7 chapters done, and then do another 7, and that became what he called his abstract, which was The Origin of Species. He worked on a theory of heredity in the 1860s, and finally in 1871, he wrote a book called The Descent of Man, and that was, as the title suggests, on human descent. Very early in his theorizing, Darwin had been aware that breeders could alter greatly say a flock of, or a herd of cattle, sheep. Breeders of dogs had produced a great many varieties through what Darwin called picking, or we would say selecting. Darwin became interested in the breeder's art, and in the 1850s, he started himself breeding pigeons. Now, most of us are only familiar with that animal that lives under trestles here in Chicago, but as you can see, you can do an awful lot with pigeons. The pigeon breeder has been able to produce something like about 90 different varieties, and Darwin himself had pens constructed in the backyard of his rather spacious house in the village of Down in Kent. And these are the kinds of varieties that breeders were able to produce, so that he was convinced that the breeder's art might give some handle on what was going on in nature. Darwin himself said that in 1838, he read for amusement a work by an economist by the name of Thomas Malthus. It was called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And Darwin, in his autobiography, indicates that this, he said, gave him a theory by which to work. So Malthus led to him formulating his idea of natural selection. He provided the key for what Malthus offered was the notion of population pressure, that more organisms are produced each period of generation than the environment can possibly sustain. And therefore, a lot of them go to the wall, they die. And Darwin concluded that if by chance any of these organisms had a useful trait that gave them an advantage over their others in their group, that those would have a better chance of reaching reproductive age and passing those traits on. And that essentially is natural selection. That's the basic view of natural selection. But and that's the view that most scholars will sign on to. But in thinking about how to apply natural selection to animals in the wild, or at least what he formed as the principle of activity that might exist in the wild, he ran across several problems. First, in artificial selection, what we take to be what the breeder is doing is artificially changing breeds. There you have a human intelligence at work, but what was comparable to human intelligence in nature? And second, how does nature prevent back crosses? Here's a problem that was called the problem of swamping. So, as an illustration, consider groups of wild dogs. And so in each litter of puppies that are produced, you'll have some of those puppies that have slightly shaggier coats than their brothers or sisters, some of them slightly longer tails, some of them would be a little faster in chasing down rabbits, some less fast. And in that group, if any had useful traits, well, those traits would allow that organism to reach reproductive age and pass them on. But if you think about what happens in the wild, who are you liable to mate with? Well, you're liable to mate with that individual next to you, as opposed to an individual that is far away. What the breeder does, however, in keeping large flocks, is able to spy an organism that has a trait the breeder likes, and he can select out that organism and another organism that has a similar trait and select that out and bring them together for mating. If the breeder didn't do that, then organisms would tend to mate with those in their vicinity, and those might not have the same useful trait, or at least the trait the breeder was interested in. So there would be the problem of swamping out, and Darwin saw that as a problem in his thinking about how to apply natural selection to nature. Also, could natural selection produce the kinds of refinements that were characteristic of other organisms, characteristic of organisms in nature? And it wasn't certain that that was possible. Here is, if you look at those wild varieties of pigeons, Darwin argued that they all came from this one, the one that we are indeed familiar with. We usually think of natural selection as a rather simple process. When Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's friend, read The Origin of Species, he sort of hit himself on the head and said, how simple that is. I should have thought of it first. How stupid of me. Well, it did take Darwin 490 pages to explain that very simple idea. What Darwin had to deal with was those three problems that I mentioned. And in order to deal with it, he thought that he had to provide a model for what was going on. And that model was going to be a model for natural selection. So as good contemporary scientists, when they're working out a theory, they will often propose to themselves, as part of the theory, a model by which to understand the complexities of the theory. And in his 1842 essay and 1844 essay, those which were virtually outlines to The Origin of Species, he presented to himself a model of what he thought was going on in nature in natural selection. And here's the model. Let us now suppose a being with penetration sufficient to perceive differences in the outer and innermost organization, quite imperceptible to man, and with forethought extending over future centuries, to watch with unerring care and select for any object the offspring of an organism produced under the foregoing circumstances. I can see no conceivable reason why he could not form a new race, or several were he to separate the stock of the original organism and work on several islands adapted to new ends. As we assume his discrimination and his forethought and his steadiness of object to be incomparably greater than those qualities in man, so we may suppose the beauty and complications of the adaptations of the new race and their differences from the original stock to be greater than in the domestic races produced by man's agency. With time enough, such a being might rationally, without some unknown law opposing him, aim at almost any result. Now that's what Darwin conceives of as a model for natural selection. And you can see this is not a model of a Manchester mechanical spinning loom. This is a model of a very powerful intellect, making choices with forethought and discrimination, making choices about the beauty and complications of organisms. This is a model, Darwin seems to have thought, that could deal with problems like swamping out, the problem of the intricate character of adaptations that organisms manifested. It's not a model of a machine, it's a model of mind. And you can find that mind being also exhibited in the book, The Origin of Species. So if you turn to that chapter in The Origin, in which Darwin is describing natural selection, he introduces again what is essentially the same model. He writes, "Man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature cares nothing for appearances, except insofar as they may be useful to any being. She can act on the internal organs, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life." I have to note that word machinery is not an attribute of natural selection. It's what natural selection is operating on. And if you do a word count on the origin, the word machine, machinery, mechanism, mechanical, any variety of that idea, variety of terms, appears only 5 times in the origin, whereas the word purpose, or its equivalent, appears something like 67 times in the origin. The model that Darwin has for the actions of nature is not that of a machine or mechanical. He goes on, "Man selects only for his own good, nature only for that of the being which she tends. Can we wonder, then, that nature's productions should be far truer in character than man's productions, that they should be infinitely better adapted to the most complex conditions of life, and should plainly bear the stamp of a far higher workmanship?" So the model that Darwin has is a model of mind at work in nature, not the model of mechanical production. Now, in the analysis that Darwin is offering, he regards nature as acting according to law. But in good 19th century fashion, he turns to laws as secondary causes, operative because they are promulgated by a primary cause. And the primary cause he denominates, in the origin, as the creator. So he has behind these laws of nature by which he wishes to explain natural events and the characteristics of organisms, he has behind that a divine mind that is operative. In the autobiography, Darwin confesses that he had, when he wrote The Origin of Species, he still believed in an intelligence comparable to our own that was governing the universe. And this epigram, as you see up on the screen, is one that is facing the title page of The Origin of Species. And it expresses, I think, what Darwin's view was at the time. He writes, quoting, actually, a passage from William Whewell, who was a philosopher, a historian, a scientist of Darwin's acquaintance. He quotes Whewell to this effect, "But with respect to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general law." What Darwin objected to in the contemporary biology of his period was not the idea that somehow the creator was behind everything. What he objected to was the notion that God stepped in at every moment and created a species, altered a species, or anything like that. Everything was to work according to law. But nonetheless, he thought that that law was authored by God. After the publication of The Origin and the first reviews came in, and what was distinctive about The Origin, Darwin never talks about human beings in The Origin except by suggestion or allusion. That comes only later in The Descent of Man. But the reason that he didn't talk explicitly about human beings in The Origin is he thought that people would get so concerned about that they wouldn't pay close attention to the theory that he was developing. In the first reviews, of course, what did they concentrate on? What does this mean for human beings? And Darwin was greatly upset at what the kind of reaction he was getting. It was suggested that he was an atheist. They didn't read very carefully The Origin, or at least many of the reviewers. He writes a friend of his in the United States, Asa Gray, to this effect. He says, "I'm inclined to look at everything as resulting from design laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance. So when you talk about design laws, this gives, I think, an indication of what he meant when he said that from the laws of nature comes the most exalted object we're capable of conceiving, namely the higher animals. And one could trace out that locution through the notebooks and see that the highest animal that he is most concerned with, of course, is human beings, and what is distinctive about human beings are their moral sentiments. In 1881, Darwin got a note asking if this individual, Edward Aveling, could visit him. Aveling was the common law husband of Karl Marx's younger daughter, and Aveling was an atheist, and he wanted Darwin's views about religion. And when he visited Darwin, Darwin confessed that he had lost his belief in Christianity about 1850. There are particular reasons we could talk about why that might have happened. But he admitted that when he finished The Origin of Species, he did believe in a mind that was governing the universe. But in the 1860s, he lost that belief and said that the term that best described his religious beliefs at that point was one coined by his friend Huxley, namely agnosticism, and he thought himself an agnostic. Let me just turn back very quickly to one of the passages from The Origin in the chapter on natural selection that reveals a certain conception of nature, I think, even more clearly than I've suggested so far. This passage reads, "It might be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being." Now that phrase, that natural selection works for the improvement of each organic being, occurs several times in The Origin. Here is just one of those times that is fairly salient. This comes in the penultimate paragraph of The Origin. "And as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental endowments will tend to progress towards perfection." That notion of evolution as a progressive force in the world is one that is not shared by contemporary biologists, but Darwin certainly believed it to be the case. And what's singular about this passage and others like it, that natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, to our ears, that is anomalous, because the way we think about natural selection is it doesn't work for the good of each being. It eliminates most beings. It destroys most beings. It's only those happy few that have favored traits that survive. So what I take it to be the case is that Darwin is so convinced of the moral goodness of natural selection that he is inclined to say things like natural selection works for the good of each being. But again, that's completely antithetic to the way we think about natural selection today. Well, maybe the message to be brought home here is simply Darwin was not a neo-Darwinian. Thank you very much.